Welcome back, risers and thrivers. We are so happy to have you here on this episode. We hope you just loved the last episode with Jeff Walker, who really opened up on all of the hardships in his stroke and in his survival that he's experienced as a young man, 48 years old, had a very severe stroke and is now empowering others through Men's Trauma Healing Network. He is just such an incredible human. If you missed the show, please log in at risetoday.com and you can pull it up there. And today, boy, do we ever have a show for you today. I'm incredibly honored to have our guest, this Netflix sensation, the river runner himself, Scott Lundgren, who's here to talk all about his journey. He is a professional kayaker. Oh my gosh, an extreme adventurer, and who has been diagnosed with brain cancer. And this diagnosis has led to these awakenings, for which he'll share with us, that has really changed the way he's chosen to live his life. So Scott, gosh, welcome to the show. We are just so honored to have you here with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for being with us. Now, I have to say my kids were the ones, my two boys were like, gosh, mommy, there's this cool new show on Netflix. We've got to watch it. And so they introduced me to all that you are and all that you propel. And I'm just so inspired by your story. So can you take us back a bit and talk about this previous life of adventure that you've always lived? I'd love to hear more about it.
I mean, it starts back to as early as I think 14 or 15 was sort of my first sort of introduction to the river. And I just happened to move next door to a family that was into rafting, and the oldest of the family was a Grand Canyon river guide, and he kind of is the one that introduced the idea of river travel to me, and actually presented the first opportunity to travel down a river. And it was something that just really resonated with me as a kid, and that right from that very first sort of experience somehow turned into a 30-year plus, journey of pursuing and seeking out river trips all over the world.
And the most extreme of river trips. What was it about the river that called to you, even at 14?
I think as if you haven't seen the movie yet, The River Runner on Netflix, I think I had a very sort of negative sort of outlook on things, mostly because of where I was from and the things that I'd kind of been introduced to. And that wasn't everything, but, the river presented this idea that there was something that you could do with your energy in a positive way instead of a negative way. And that really resonated with me. And so, there was this shift very early on in that, like, instead of doing things that would get me in trouble, I could take that same energy and push it towards learning and understanding what it would take to travel down rivers. And it wasn't extreme in the beginning. It was very mellow. I did get a couple of experiences where I kind of got to run some harder rivers, but in the beginning, it started out really mellow, and then, over a significant amount of time, it kind of built on itself.
What were some of those negative pursuits, perhaps, that you were doing before, if you don't mind me asking?
Well, no, not at all. So I grew up in the Valley, and so it was, the sort of San Bernardino, Fresno, Visalia, like these sort of, I guess the environment was not the most amazing environment for, say, like the outdoors or participating in the outdoors. And so, as a kid, I've always said that you're a product of your environment a lot of times, unless you have somebody that is really helping guide and shape that experience. And my brother and I were a product of divorced parents, and we were raised by our mom. We had very few rules growing up. And so we were mischievous and pretty aggro, and we just ended up, choosing some things that definitely had put chinks in our character, and it just really made it sort of hard. I think that anytime when somebody grows up in a neighborhood where, for instance, there's drug dealers on the corner, there's, that sort of environment, and it's really hard to break out of that environment, right? If you don't know anything different. And so, and then, a lot of times when you're in that environment, you become a product of that environment, and your influences everything, right? And so, and you're impressionable, especially as a young kid. You're super impressionable. And so, and you don't have the tools to really decipher, say, what's good and bad, unless you have some sort of guiding figure that can help navigate that for you. And my parents, as amazing as they were very hands off, and there was a lot of me raising my brother, and there was a lot of freedom that was granted to us as kids. And we just found ourselves in these situations that were, looking back at it, not the most positive situations.
I understand. And so you found the river to be this incredible positive outlet.
Yeah, so the river kind of came a little bit later. Both my brother and I were into sports. For me, the sport of choice was soccer. And that was sort of my first thing that I really, was introduced to. And I had played soccer from, a very early age up and through high school. Actually, I played soccer, and, I was into BMX, I was into skateboarding, and, those sorts of things were, the few things that I was sort of curious and interested that were positive. And so, and I was a natural athlete. And so that kind of fed into it as well. I think my mom, in talking with her later, both my brother and I were ADHD. We were very hyper kids, and, things that they use now, like with drugs and stuff, to bring that behavior under control. My mom was always about, don't come in the house before dark. You're playing a sport, whether you have a choice or not. She was always had us in the backyard working or whatever to try to expend that energy. And looking back on it now, I actually truly feel that, ADHD is an actual gift. I think it's for so many people, it is misconstrued, in that you have this inner fire, and it's how that inner fire is guided.
Yes.
That really is the game changer. And if it's guided down a pharmaceutical road, that to me is heartbreaking. Whereas if it's guided down an active road, that to me seems the way forward. You're just taking someone that's wound up a little bit more than somebody else, and it's just really alleviating that energy in a healthy way that is the game changer.
Important. So when you were on the river, Scott, can I ask you, what did you feel?
Well, in general, or just like, yeah, I mean, I think as a kid, it just presented, opportunity. And so I just really felt, one of the first things that it did for me straight away was that I was able to get to a space to where I was able to go to a guide school. And that was really the first big impression that I got. And it was like this 10-day guide school. And we basically loaded up on a bus, and we drove around and ran a bunch of rivers and learned sort of the art of river travel. And that was all through rafting. And right after I got out of that guide school, I was having trouble trying to find a job. I was too young. Nobody would really hire me. And the company that my next door neighbor worked for was this company called Outdoors Unlimited and in Grand Canyon.
Okay.
And so I reached out just on a whim and called the owner and said, hey, I'm really interested in rowing a baggage boat trip. And what that means is that, they have, paid guides that row clients, and then they have these baggage boats that carry all the gear, and you basically, row an empty boat with everybody's gear and equipment and so forth. And so it was something that in every guide school, the top guide, that was sort of the prize that they won. And so they got to go to Grand Canyon, and I was far from the top guide out of guide school, but I called anyways and just happened to call on the right day and got the opportunity to go row a Grand Canyon trip right after I got out of guide school. And it was that Grand Canyon trip that really changed my perspective. It was a 14-day trip, and you just load up the rafts with food and gear, and you disappear for 14 days, and 2 weeks, and you come out the other end. And it was really after that. And then I got super lucky again as I got off that trip. Another baggage boatman had canceled, and I went right back out again, and I did 2 back-to-back trips. So I did a month straight in Grand Canyon as like a 17-year-old kid, 18-year-old kid. And that really changed my perspective on everything. I mean, it just sang to me in a way that nothing else had ever sang to me before. I love the adventure. I love the idea of horizon lines. I love the idea of learning how to navigate. I love the idea of rigging. I love, the idea of going on hikes. I loved being in nature. I liked sleeping on the ground. Just everything. It was such a positive change into everything else that was going on in my life. And it was with a bunch of people that were not too dissimilar from me. As there's a lot of people that had found a similar sort of thing with the river, where they had not maybe come from the best background ever, but then had found this river guide lifestyle and had, it had resonated with them as well. And so, yeah, I was able to connect and relate with a lot of the guides that were working down there. And I knew from that point on that I really wanted to work as a river guide, as a raft guide at that point. And I had started to kayak a little bit, but I hadn't really had the opportunity. Back in those days, it was really tricky. Kayaking was a tiny sport. It still is a tiny sport, but the innovation in kayak design and the number of people that were doing it, and it just wasn't readily available.
What year would that have been, Scott, when you were 17-ish?
So it was like 1989.
Okay.
Yeah, 88, 89, something like that. And so my summers just turned into, as I was kind of finishing up high school, I would go and work as a river guide in California, and I was able to subsequently get work after I did those 2 trips in Grand Canyon. It kind of gave me enough on my resume to where, some of the owners of these rafting companies would take a chance with me and let me start running rivers in California. And then it just really kind of built from there. And it wasn't until I actually graduated from high school, and I had finished up a rafting season in Idaho, where I had the opportunity to kayak a bunch. And I moved to Costa Rica for about 8 months.
Okay.
And I basically kayaked every day.
Wow.
And I came home it was kind of a make or break sort of situation. I had kind of told my mom that I needed some time off from high school before going to school, off to college. And I came home from Costa Rica and was not interested in going to college. All I was interested in doing was figuring out how to kayak as much as possible and work as a river guide.
Now, you just felt so alive on the water. You love the thrill.
Yeah, it was a combination of everything. It was the lifestyle, I love the idea that, there's rivers everywhere in the world and that you could travel.
Mhm.
It was something that really interested me. I love the idea that I could go to Costa Rica, or that I could go to the Himalayas, or that I could go to Europe or anywhere in the world. There's rivers everywhere, right? And that's the one really cool thing about the river community, is it is an international community of people, and people are running trips all over the world. And if you can figure out a way to kind of get involved with some of that stuff, it was an unbelievable vehicle for seeing the world. And I learned that very early on. A lot of the river guides that I worked with in Grand Canyon, they all worked in Chile in the winter months. Here it's, obviously South America is their summer. And so they would go to South America and work as river guides. And so they were on this sort of endless summer lifestyle. And that really sang to me. I just really loved everything about that idea. And so as soon as I had the opportunity to take advantage of that, I did. And then as soon as I did, I was like, okay, I'm not going back to school anytime soon. I'm gonna kind of pursue this and see what happens.
And that connection piece that you discussed, when we don't feel alone and when we feel we belong, that sense of belonging with our people, that would be also hard to shift from and just go to school. You had found your passion, you had found your calling, it sounds like.
Yeah, for sure. I think, it's always tricky. It was hard on my mom. My mom had aspirations for, getting a college degree, and it drove a bit of a stake in our relationship for a while. And then I had the opportunity to row my mom down the Grand Canyon a few years later.
Wow.
And she was able to, understand very quickly how amazing of a choice that I had made. It's
Wow.
always tricky when your parents don't see a future or don't see a profession, right? And then all of a sudden they see, why you're doing it, and how it sings to you. And it was amazing, because then my mom went from somebody that really didn't understand what I was doing and why I was doing it, to being, my biggest supporter.
That's amazing. That's such a beautiful shift that you've experienced with her. And
Mm.
you are not only a guide, I mean, you are a leader, and you have chosen to pursue really the most, extreme of extreme rivers. And you have taken those on board with you, your nearest and dearest, on these pursuits with you. And it's not always been easy. I know you've lost those that are close to you. How did you navigate that at the time?
First of all, the progression into running hard whitewater kind of happened over, a significant amount of time.
Okay.
It takes a lot to get to the space to make running super dangerous rivers comfortable. And it just, like anything, they always say 10,000 hours to master something. Kayaking is no different. I think for normal people, when they look at kayaking, they think crazy. I typically fire back with, what do you spend your time doing? And are you pretty good at what you spend? If you spend a bunch of time doing something, the idea is to get comfortable and get good at what you're doing. And if it's your profession, or whether it's your hobby or your passion,
Sure.
whatever, it's whatever you put your energy into, right? And so one of the biggest things is developing a comfort zone, to where you're, able to weigh out the risk and weigh out the sort of danger that inherently comes with traveling down super dangerous rivers. And you get to that space to where you become comfortable in that environment. And for me, it wasn't something that happened overnight. It took a long period of time to get to that space. There was a long build up to it. And once I got to it, it wasn't until I was probably 23 or 24. I had started to go to the Himalayas and kayak when I was 19, 20, and I had started to run harder and harder rivers. And I got an opportunity to do a river in Western Nepal called the First Descent of the Tuliberry. And I did that for a film called Adventure Quest. And it was a show on this network called the Outdoor Life Network. And I did it with this producer, director, cinematographer, this guy named Roger Brown. And he had this assistant, and they were basically on a trail following us down the river, and they weren't able to actually get to the river. And so I had this opportunity to kayak and then also pick up a video camera for the first time. And those two things just kind of came together. And that's when the whole filming and running hard rivers, and that film went on to do really well. It actually won at Banff that year, the Banff Mountain Film Festival. And Roger, the director, producer, cinematographer, ended up hiring me after that. And I ended up training and apprenticing under him for a couple years, and ended up winning an Emmy a couple years later for a film that we did in the Andes. It's called Andes to Amazon, where we climbed this peak, and then we kind of walked down the peak, and then we ran this river into the Amazon, and then, you know, came out of the Amazon. And
just for those who haven't seen the show, like when they're climbing the peak, you're carrying your board, like you're carrying your kayak. It's incredible.
Yeah, sometimes for sure. Sometimes, yeah. Sometimes you're hiking up over stuff, and
like just watching the feat of athleticism on its own, it's just remarkable. It's so awe-inspiring.
Yeah, and so that just became sort of once I had sort of won that Emmy, it really gave me an opportunity to go raise money to start doing these wilder expeditions. And so with that, you start pushing the limits of things. And then we, you know, unfortunately have lost quite a few people. I mean, rivers are forgiving until they're not. Especially when I was younger, it was river travel, and rivers were sort of, and the people that I was doing it with were sort of the only things that I really had much respect for, mostly because of the bonds that were being created in those environments. It's not much dissimilar than, say, like going to war, you know, like when you're there, you know, going, you know, doing something super strenuous and psychologically taxing, then that's what really separates kayaking from, say, a ton of other sports like skiing or mountain biking or surfing or any of these other things. You know, we would sign up for these trips that, you know, you would put on, and 30 days later you'd come out the bottom. And so they were just these sort of really hard expeditions where you had to stay in control the whole time. And you know, you would surround yourself with people that were like-minded. And if you saw any sort of emotional instability or any sort of behavior that would be sort of threat to the expedition, a lot of times we ended up just ostracizing that, because it just added a sort of hazard and threw a sort of wrench at the safety of the trip.
That was seen as a weakness.
Absolutely, it was perceived as a weakness, and it worked. And what made it more sort of powerful was that we were getting accolades to, you know, for the behavior. And where I basically couldn't put together is how to compartmentalize that behavior and leave that behavior on the river. I ended up dragging it out to all facets of my life. And so everything became, you know, harden up, downstream, why are you crying? You know, like
push that emotion down.
And no room for emotional instability, emotional IQ way low.
Yeah, I saw in the movie, even after you would lose close friends, you would have a couple drinks and
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of
emotional
people,
avoidance.
yeah, for sure. I mean, like, once again, this is, a coping mechanism that I inherited. And
It's not
so it
not
was,
just you, like emotional avoidance happens day in and day out, but we often don't
yeah,
have the self-awareness to recognize it, right?
yeah, for sure. I think I had inherited a couple of deeply rooted patterns. I didn't have really any sort of tools to sort of handle it in a healthy way. So if there was a high, you'd inebriate. If there was a low, you would inebriate. If something became difficult, I would run. And it would be so easy because I would be so fulfilled in expedition kayaking and going on these trips and just buying a plane ticket and going kayaking, that it was just easy for me to run and inebriate on highs and lows.
And it shows up in all different forms, right? This emotional avoidance idea. Like for you, you'd inebriate, you'd run, right? For me, before my own self-awareness and my mindfulness and all the shifts I've experienced, I would keep myself busy 100%. Like I would intentionally fill my calendar. I could not be by myself. If I was by myself, I felt almost worthless, to be honest. I needed to fill that calendar to every minute. I overworked. I started work at 5 a.m. I was a sports chiropractor by trade. I finished at 11 p.m. some nights, like I just filled that schedule completely to avoid all those emotions. And I was very upbeat. I was very positive in nature. I didn't even have the awareness to know that I had pushed down so much.
Yeah, I think it's a pattern that a lot of people fall into. Avoidance is absolute, and distraction is a huge thing, and burying things, and it does work to an extent.
Sometimes it's the wisdom of our bodies, right? And Dr. Gabor Mate, I'm one of his biggest fans, but he calls it the wisdom of trauma. Right? Because sometimes it's too overbearing. It's too overwhelming for us to face those emotions at that time. So we almost inherently develop these survival mechanisms, whether it's, alcohol or, pushing the limits on every front with the river, even could be an emotional avoidance strategy. Whether it's, I don't know, for some, eating too much, eating too little, shopping too much, too much contact with friends like I had, or too little. There's so many different emotional avoidance strategies that we all adopt, but we don't see these as our survival mechanisms.
No, flight or fight.
Right?
Yeah. Yes. I mean, and if you've been in that, and for me, one of the first sort of realizations that I had was that I had been in fight or flight my entire life. And that's where I was at my best, was in fight or flight.
So let's talk about when you had that realization, though.
So the realization came much, much later. I was diagnosed with a brain tumor.
Let's talk about this.
Yeah, so I had sort of this experience where, in a kayak, where all of a sudden things that were very normal and very sort of second nature were no longer normal and second nature, and it spooked me. And it tends to happen a lot with kayaking. Kayaking is really forgiving until it's not. And then as soon as it becomes not forgiving, it really can be detrimental. And so,
example, like what were you noticing that was no longer second nature?
Well, so like, for instance, flipping upside down, and flipping upside down in a kayak, to somebody that spent a ton of time in a kayak or as a professional kayaker, and flipping right back up is really not a big deal. But all of a sudden what was happening was I was flipping upside down and I was struggling flipping right side up. And I was actually losing spatial awareness upside down. Whereas before, I would flip upside down and know exactly where I was at, and I could put my body in a situation to flip right back up as quickly as possible.
That must have been scary.
Yeah, super scary. I mean, especially when you're running super hard rivers in the middle of nowhere, and all of a sudden you went from, and so at that point I really was like, okay, I'm not really feeling right. I feel like something intuitively is off. I'm going to take a little time off. And I was probably 3 months out of the kayak, and things weren't really getting any better. And I went in for some blood work, and I came back with hypothyroidism. And so that started to explain some stuff, because my hormones were really off a lot, so I went from being able to like hike over 20,000 foot passes and go on 30-day kayak expeditions to struggling to go for a run. And so, that at that point I was like, man, maybe I'm, getting older. I was in my, mid to late 30s at that point, and it was maybe time to step back. And so, river travel was the only thing I knew, other than, filmmaking. And so I just lost my sort of passion for the river, and then filmmaking kind of went by the wayside. And then the only two things that I really had left were the sort of inebriation side of things, and that burned out after a couple of years. And so I still though felt like something was wrong, and it wasn't until 4 or 5 years of being out of my kayak when I had my first headache. Wow. And so I had been chasing a ghost for quite some time, and as I said, I knew something was wrong, but none of my doctors picked up on it, and none of the tests that were coming back that they asked for showed anything out of the ordinary. And so finally, when I had the knockout headache, I had one, and then I had another about 4 days later, and ended up in a CT, and then I blew up the CT scan and was diagnosed in 2015, beginning in 2015.
It's so hard to, like, that phase when something's wrong, but that there are no answers. You almost feel, then you question yourself. Well, I guess I'm not right, but always listening and hearing the screams of your body. It's so important to keep pushing and keep being our own biggest advocate.
Yeah, it's crazy because, I'd always, I feel like more now that I'm so much more in tune and heightened with what's going on with my body. Whereas like when you're a kid, I think, I didn't have anyone to show me how to be in tune with my body, and I just was able to continue to push without, and to shove down and push and shove down and push. And, eventually that catches up with you. You can pretend like that's not going to ever catch up with you, but eventually it does. Or what ends up happening is you end up just repeating behavior, and you end up spinning and doing the same thing over and over and over again. And you see these things happening to you. You see yourself getting triggered by certain things that cause certain behaviors. But then what happens is that as soon as you're triggered into a behavior, you don't know how to make the behavior stop. And then time goes by, you shove it down, and then you kind of go about your life until you're triggered again, or till something happens. Yep. And so, and then even then, and I think that's one of the things that gave me strength in telling my story, because I don't know why I got the opportunity I did. I don't know how I ended up in the situation that I ended up. I don't know that I deserved it. I don't know that it definitely was not scripted. It was just somehow I was led down this road, and I was able to have these things presented to me in a way that really helped me come to these sort of conclusions and awarenesses that changed the direction and the way that I was thinking. And it wasn't like some amazing one event. I mean, there was probably a dozen events that happened. And
how did you start hearing these awakenings? Like, how did you start? Was there one magic moment that was like a light bulb that went off, or was it just like, gosh, I pushed so much down along the way? What was it that really sparked that?
Well, I think, initially when it was all in stages. So even before I was diagnosed with a brain tumor, there was a couple years before where I had stopped the sort of drinking and the drugs, and I had started to practice yoga. Yoga really had started to help, but it was still very primitive in that it wasn't really dealing with anything from my childhood or anything from kayaking or any of the people that I had lost through kayaking or any of the behaviors that were showing up for me. And then, I think anytime you're diagnosed with cancer or a brain tumor, my biggest, I might be a little bit unusual in this. I think some people, my personal big, I've never had a fear of going to the other side. That was not my fear. My fear was coming out less than whole and being a paraplegic or being blind or being not able to live the way that I've lived, my entire life. I would rather flip over to the other side. That's kind of what the story I had told myself, that was sort of
that was your fear factor.
Yeah, 100%. Like when I went in for the operation, I wasn't looking at death so much. I was looking at like coming out not seeing, or I was looking at, paralysis, or I was looking at crazy hormone stuff, where I was like, it was like trying to stand on top of a beach ball, right? You just, and that to me, I had more fear built around that than just transitioning over. Because I had felt like I'd lived this incredibly blessed life. I mean, I got to live my dream. I got to travel the world and run rivers, and I felt so grateful for that. And so when the tumor was diagnosed and then I had a successful brain surgery, I came out of brain surgery and I started to heal physically. I was healing in ways that, when you have a tumor or you have something happen to you with cancer, there's this incredibly like slow, well, not always, but for me, it was a slow transition. And so, yes, the signs and the symptoms came, but they came really slowly. So cognitively, you're not as aware of the change and how much you've actually changed as a human, as a person. And that was my case. And then I started to realize as the tumor got removed, how much I had changed and how much my body had changed. Just my equilibrium was back. My head was clear. My ears were clear. My thoughts were clear. All of these things were, the tumor was a little bit in between a golf ball and a baseball. It was huge, and it was pressing on my right ocular eye. And so when you have a mass like that, and then it was messing with my hormones, my hypothyroidism was going. And so I don't ever like to use that as an excuse for my behavior, but it absolutely has a very profound, experience on yourself. Right. And so I struggled when I started to physically heal. I was physically healing, but I wasn't mentally healing. Mm-hmm. And all of those behaviors and patterns that I thought would go away if I physically healed myself didn't go away. And so then I was left empty. And then I started to fall back into pattern, and I had developed a new sort of behavior that wasn't new to me, was isolation, right? because I didn't know how to ask for help, because I didn't want anyone to know that I had a tumor, because I didn't want anyone to know that I was weak, because I'd spent my entire life not being weak.
You didn't know who you were.
And so and it's tricky, because I say this to a lot of people with cancer and a lot of people with tumors, and this is also what's given me strength to share so much, is that, isolation's a funny thing. It's not a funny thing. It's an incredibly powerful thing, in that humans figured out very early on, say like in a prison environment, right? If you act out in prison, where do they send you? They send you to the hole, because they know the most powerful thing that they can do to self-inflict harm on someone is to isolate them in a dark space. And what would be worse than that? Self-inflicted isolation, right? You can see, you can breathe, you can walk, you can get in your car, you can go and do and be, but you can't. You're trapped. And so a lot of people, when they get diagnosed, women seem to do better than men. Men seem to struggle with it a lot more. But like me, I fell straight into pattern, and I made my family, I made my closest friends. I didn't want anyone to know. I made them swear that they wouldn't say anything to anyone. And that put me in this position to where I was trapped.
That secrecy alone leads to shame.
100%. That was my next thing. Right. Yeah. So then there's shame.
Yeah.
And so then you're just, and then think about how that weighs on your heart, and how that weighs on your soul, and how that weighs on you healing, and how that weighs on your endocrine system, right? It just is, it just takes you and does that. And so I kind of got to a point to where not only did I have a brain tumor, but then I got a DUI. And so then, that kind of helped. I had been sober for a really long time, and I slipped up and then ended up getting like slapped super hard again. And I was just like, stuck. And so I ended up going through a few
Isn't
things.
That the worst feeling when you're stuck? That's like the worst feeling. Like,
you're just stuck. And
for me, I felt like institutionalized against my will when I was in the hospital.
100%. Yeah. And so
I felt isolated for a different reason, because in the hospital, in those 4 white walls, you're all alone in there, right? People can come in and out, but you're alone. You're by yourself at night. But over time, it was those very same walls and the solitude that taught me all of those awakenings.
Yeah. And so very similar situation. And then, in the film, if you've seen the film, I meet a girl, and she was, her emotional IQ was, way up here, and mine was still way down there. And so there was an ultimatum that was made, and I felt like I needed to do something to kind of shift where I was at. And so she had been to a lot of different things, and so she recommended a few things. And so I slowly started to go through this sort of journey of figuring out why I'm wired the way that I am, and the behaviors, and the negative love patterns, and the vicious cycles, and the behaviors, and why I do things the way that I do them, and then to bring awareness around that, and then how to make some of that stuff stop.
Well, and I think that's powerful, right? How you're saying, she introduced you to these different healing ideas, right? And I always say, people come into our lives for either they're either, everyone that comes into our life, they're either a lesson or they're a blessing, right? Because they teach us and they're there for a purpose. They're not always meant to stay, but they're always there for a purpose. And that sounds like perfect for that, that she really initiated that spark.
100%. Yeah. Because in the past, if I would have been triggered by somebody or somebody's behavior, it would, I would just push away and run, and instead of like pushing away and running, as you just said, what can I learn from this? And instead of being triggered or pushing that person away, going inward and asking yourself, why am I being so triggered by this person's behavior? Or why am I being so triggered by what's being presented to me? Yeah. And then all of a sudden I'm looking at that person with compassion instead of hatred, or I'm looking at them as a vulnerable weakness or any of those sorts of things. And I think that that's one of the biggest things that frustrates me a lot with like the woke community and the blame game with the woke community. And granted, some of that stuff is valid, but a lot of people are so easily offended by something that someone says. And if people were to actually go inward and ask themselves why they're so offended by what is being said to them that is offending them, what's triggering them, and it doesn't even have to be, a stranger. Most of the time, it's your parents, it's your significant other, it's your kids, right? I just remember like my dad, I just had so much animosity towards my dad for some of his behaviors. And he would just say like one thing and I would just be so triggered by it. And it would just cause like this 5-year-old response. And to have awareness around that, and to have awareness that like, wait, like he has this behavior and this thing that he's like, why am I being so upset by like what he's doing and saying? And then once I was able.
You really nailed it, because you said, we just talked about this in the last show too, and it's such an important point to raise. It's so important because you said once you started asking the why, right, you looked back and you found more self-compassion for that little boy, right? And then those walls of self-judgment, they start to dissipate. And that's huge.
It's huge, because then, like what ended up happening for me, one of the most powerful exercises that I ever did was, I was in this program and they sat us down and we basically imagined our parents as a child. And we imagined them in their environment with their parents. And then I was able to look at them as a child, and then I was able to look at them and their behaviors, and then I was able to look at their patterns, and then I was able to look at their vicious cycles and how they were passed on to me. And then
not only when we find self-compassion for ourselves, like you did, and even going through this process and looking at your parents' behaviors and that intergenerational trauma, but you can also then find a level of compassion for your parents because they too have adopted these survival mechanisms for their own traumas, right?
100,
and that compassion is like a ripple effect. It's really incredible.
100%. And so then it became so much more like, once it changed the way I looked at my parents. Now, does that mean that I don't set safe boundaries? 100%. You still set safe boundaries, and you do that with clarity. But
the gift is that it's so freeing.
100. No, you're not. You're not. When somebody's attacking you verbally, or somebody's saying something that is not resonating with you or that you disagree with, you're no longer, flipping them off or fighting with them or arguing with them. You're actually like, wow, I actually feel bad.
Yes.
And you can find why you feel that way.
Yes.
And so it just changes your perspective, and
The
you're no
entire outlook.
longer,
The
yeah,
entire
and
outlook.
you as an adult, you can surround yourself with people that feed your soul instead of drain your soul.
And it's almost
And
like it gives us the opportunity to rewrite our story when we go through that process.
well,
Right?
that's what so many people end up protecting,
Yes.
is that they have the story that they've written in their mind.
Yep.
And they will stand by that story, and they'll follow it through truth or lies, deceit. They'll do everything in their power to protect their story. And once you can let go of your story and be open to rewriting a new story, like that gives you so much more life, and so much, it lightens everything up around you so much more. It's like one of the most amazing realizations that I had.
I just feel like you float. Like when I say like, it's just so freeing. You just feel so light. And I just feel like I'm flying when you go.
Yeah, because you're no longer carrying those things that, I had this idea, wrapped around me, that my identity was kayaking, and that if I wasn't a kayaking, I was worthless and selfless, and I was empty, and that I had nothing to offer anyone. And your ego keeps you from, like, it keeps you from actually, it doesn't want you to let go. It wants you to keep telling that
That's
story.
right.
And so you would show up with a group of people, and your ego would somehow charge in, and it would just prop up that identity, that story that you kept telling yourself over and over and over again. And then if you're at all smart, or your intellect is involved, you can sit there and just, you can just talk yourself into these things and into these patterns, but you're living in a glass house at that point, because all the stuff that you built up has nowhere to go.
Well, and you really phrased it so eloquently when you said it's like this heavy weight, right? And I always, when I work with my coaching clients, I talk a lot about this energy reserve tank that we all have, right? We have a certain amount of energy. And think of how much energy that is when we're allocating to holding that weight. And for me on my own healing journey, when I survived terminal cancer, people are always asking me, was it the green juice? Was it the waving the magic crystals? What was it? And I don't have an answer. If I had an answer, cancer wouldn't be here today, right? But I believe it was this whole inward transformation. And for me, a huge part of this was that exact idea of going in and healing those wounds and sitting with the pain that I had buried and learning to sit with it and then letting it go.
Yeah. And then developing the tools, instead of what most people, or what a lot of people end up doing, is they end up using those other sort of mechanisms from the past: inebriation, running, self-inflicted isolation, like all of those sort of negative love patterns that cause so much damage and don't actually change anything in your life. They just, send you and hold you down.
And you have to be aware, like you're saying, of those emotional avoidance strategies and make the necessary changes to create changes in those habits. I always
you have to be
like
taught
the habits that keep us a caterpillar. We have to change those habits and adopt habits to become a butterfly and fly high, because it really is letting go of that.
Yeah, I've always said that, openly, and I was hesitant in the beginning, but, and I'm still battling a brain tumor now. And I've always said that my tumor was a gift. It was something that was manifested as a gift for me, as an opportunity to change. 100%.
I can't agree more. I just spoke on stage on Friday, and I used the analogy of sometimes rocks are thrown our way to use as the foundation for our next great adventures, right? Sometimes the rocks of adversity, we need to do the work, lay them down in the foundation for what's to come ahead. And I know for me personally, gosh, I feel like with all that I've been through in my survival, it's a feat I too am here with you today. But I just feel like I've been pummeled around and around and around in this crazy tidal wave, relentless tidal wave, right? Where just when I'd come up for a sip of air, I'd be pulled back down violently again to be pummeled around and around. But yet it all served to propel me onto this beautiful path that I am now, to serve in the ways that I am doing. I feel like it's all meant to be. I feel like the me that I was on before this journey, I was on a highway and my leukemia physician was like, look, Erica, you've just taken a little, you've gotten off on an exit ramp. You're going to find that entrance ramp really soon. And then with all the different feats that I faced, the rise and fall, I kept saying, darn, year after year, I was like, where's that darn entrance ramp? Where is it? Like, I felt like I was gypped, I was promised this entrance ramp back onto my highway. And I was mad about it, Scott. Like, I was mad. I was like, I have done the work. I've learned all these awakenings. Like, this is my time to shine. Where is this entrance ramp? And I've come to learn that, it punted me off that highway that I wasn't supposed to be on. And it propelled me onto this direction that was always meant for me in the first place. But I sure had to go through a lot of bumpy roads to find it.
Yeah, I mean, that's the other thing that is so interesting about a lot of the kids and a lot of the way that things are these days, and raising kids that are set up, protecting kids from failure, and how would you know what success really truly feels like if you don't have failure, or if you don't, how do you know what that feels like? You have to have a yin and a yang, and your greatest lessons are when you're down, and when there's failure, or when there's loss, or when there's, and then it's then developing really healthy mechanisms to safely pivot and move forward and change. And so now if something traumatic or something bad happens, I look at it as an opportunity. I don't look at it as a negative. I look at it as an opportunity, and I think that was one of the most powerful gifts for me, in that, like, okay, like, that didn't work. Let's pivot and let's try something else. And if that doesn't work, pivot and try something else. And, maybe it never gets to where you want it to be, and that's okay too. You learned a bunch, and then you shift, and then you just keep shifting, and you keep moving, and you take,
those that experiment the most win the most. And you're talking just about that. You shift, you pivot, you shift, you pivot, you see what works. Those that experiment the most win the most.
100%. And so a huge thing for me, and what helped me realize that, was Michael Springer's book, Untethered Soul, or The Surrender Experiment. Both of those books are amazing. And The Surrender Experiment was really interesting to me. And the idea of, when I had come to the realization that everything, I had tried to control everything in my life, and once I was diagnosed with a brain tumor, no matter what I did, no matter how hard I tried, it didn't necessarily mean that I was going to end up with the outcome that I wanted. For the first time in my life, I felt like, other than the river, I felt like I had no control over the situation. And then it was like, well, wait a minute, what do I actually have control of? And then it was like, really, I don't have control of anything, right? You don't really have control of anything in life. You can show up, you can try to control it, but that doesn't mean that's going to be the outcome that you want. And whether it be a negative or a positive, think about the high and the low of that, versus you just showing up instead of with your intellect and your ego and your emotional child and all of these other sorts of behaviors. And you just show up with your heart, you put your heart and soul into it. And if it doesn't go the way that your heart and your soul were hoping it was going to go, then that was an amazing learning opportunity to pivot and go in another direction.
And you're just so right. For me, it was taking off that sense of control, because you and I are similar in that front, right? On all the things I couldn't control in terms of what happened to me with cancer. I had no control. I'm facing a 2-month terminal prognosis, right? I have really no control on how that outcome is going to unfold. But I did have control on how I chose to live this minute and the power of right here and right now.
Yeah.
And I always chose to turn my focus into how I wanted to live. So I turned my focus onto life, right? And how I could maximize the moment of now. And that for me meant, how could I fuel my body? How could I fuel my mind? How could I fuel my soul? And that's how I took accountability in control of the things I could and surrendered to all that I couldn't.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah.
You and I have so much to talk about, and our conversations are not done. But for today, please tell us, please tell my audience, where are you at today, Scott? You are facing brain cancer, and that has got to be a lot on your mind as well. So tell us where you're at with that.
Yeah, so I just about a month ago, 5 weeks ago, I found out my tumor was growing again, and so I'm looking at another operation here in the next year or so to mitigate that growth. And so,
what did that feel like when you heard that news, Scott?
I didn't really put too much energy into it. It just, I've been doing these N of 1 studies with a couple different folks in the medical world, and so I'm still very hopeful that I can figure out a way to get this thing to shrink. And so I'm healthy. I don't have any signs or symptoms, so I'm early on, whereas before it was like, we need to do this right now sort of thing. So I've got a little bit of time. I'm in the middle of writing a book right now. And so I really want to get that taken care of. We're shooting hopefully for springtime this next year of having that done. And then if some of the stuff that I'm trying now doesn't work, then I would probably be looking at like another surgery in the fall of 2022. Yeah.
Well, we'll look forward to following your journey. And
thanks so much.
You and I are going to be in close touch. How can my listeners get in touch with you, Scott?
Instagram, Scott Lundgren _ That's a good place to go. I'm not as much on Facebook, but I'm on Facebook as well. So either one of those.
The River Runner.
Yeah, and go see the River Runner's everywhere now. We're on iTunes, we're on Amazon Prime, we're on Hulu. I don't know if we're on YouTube. I mean, basically, if you Google it, you can find a million places to rent it or buy it, or you can go on Netflix and watch it for free.
Well, my kids are going to want to meet you. You've been a huge inspiration, even to them, as you've shared the awakenings that you've experienced, even through that show. They can't wait to hear this. They can't wait to hear all that you've shared.
Awesome. Thanks. Yeah. I mean, we've got the book coming out, and so hopefully end of 2022. So that'll be, super excited for that as well.
Can you leave my listeners and my audience perhaps with one bit of actionable, tangible advice that they can practice today in their everyday lives to live their best life today?
I don't know. I've always said live life to the fullest, and follow your dreams, follow your heart, listen to your soul. Yeah. Let go of your ego, let go of your intellect, let go of your identity. Just, I think it's such a more eloquent way to travel through life.
Yes. Find that calm in the eye of the storm.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay, Scott, I can't thank you.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank
Cheers.
You.
Yep.
Okay, risers and thrivers, thank you for joining us today. We have very much appreciated, and we love your feedback, so please keep that coming. All the best. Until next time, rise today, my friends.
It's gonna be a good day.
Thanks so much for joining us today. Take this inspiration forward. Learn more at risetoday.com/podcast. And please do help us in our mission to spread hope, inspiration, and positivity by encouraging those in your circle to join us and to tune in for our next show of inspiration coming soon. Please contact us if you have a powerful story to share with us to inspire the world. Until next time, get out there and rise today.